So you speak English pretty well. Where did you grow up?
Thank you. Um, I just practiced English a lot and went to the Netherlands a bit. I've been also to the UK for 6 years.
So, where do you stand theologically?
So I started as a Christian, um, and then a couple of years ago, like 3 years ago, I transitioned to being messianic. Started to follow the Torah, and and then I realized a couple of things about the New Testament. First of all, Paul. I realized that he's talking against the Torah quite a bit. So I dropped Paul, and then I started to compare different books of the New Testament, um, and and then I realized contradictions there, contradictions in Luke and John and Revelation. So I dropped those, and then I found Tovia Singer, as I mentioned it too, and so his explanations helped me to drop the New Testament altogether. So that's where I stand right now, and I think I flexed my critical muscles a little bit, reading the scriptures. And so for that reason, I also started to go through some of the Old Testament things and Old Testament books, and I saw some contradictions there as well, which may not be contradictions, maybe just misunderstanding something. So that's why I want to check with you.
Okay, cool. So let's start. What's the first
Okay.
contradiction?
Okay. Cool. So in Genesis 17, 17 to 19, um, God is telling Abraham that he's going to have a son and the promises, and then he's starting to laugh, um, and it seems like that the laughing of Abraham wasn't a bad thing. Now a chapter later, Genesis 18 verse 11 to 15, Sarah is laughing about the same thing, about the promise of a son in her old age, and it seems to be a bad thing because she's being rebuked. Um, so that's like a small contradiction, but
Mhm.
I'm going to get deeper. That's just the start. I'm going chronology.
Sure. I wouldn't call that so much a contradiction in our theology. That's
Mm,
just part of the narrative. What makes the Torah different are the commandments within it. That's what makes it shine. Don't
mm,
forget, everything that appears in the book of Genesis was the last thing that was written to the Torah, and it's technically not Torah. Torah just means instructions, the instructions we received from the Almighty. So the understanding is that Moses threw in this tradition, Adam Arishon, Noah, Avram Avinu, all these ideas, he threw it in, but this is not the basis of our theology. The basis of our theology is a good God caring enough about his creation to give us a standard so we can elevate ourselves above the animal. That's
mhm,
Judaism.
mhm,
And when someone quotes the Epic of Gilgamesh and they're like, oh, well, the Noah story is not authentic, this doesn't break our theology in any way because that's not what our
mhm,
theology stands on.
mhm,
Now, if the Torah made you a worse individual, if those instructions didn't actually better this planet, then Judaism would fail.
mhm,
People put too much on narrative. It gives room for offshoots to develop. Every offshoot that came from Judaism, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Mormonism, only tries to improve on the narrative,
mhm,
not on the ethical, because you can improve on the ethical.
mhm,
That's the special part. You understand? Anyone could try to add a cooler creation story or add more fearless characters. That doesn't bring you closer to God. That doesn't make you a better person. It doesn't improve your family life or your community.
mhm,
It's the instructions within the Torah that are special, that are life changing, not the narrative. As a matter of fact, everything that happens from Genesis chapter 3 to Exodus chapter 20 are not necessarily things that we should emulate. It's almost there to teach us what not to do, or then it doesn't even make sense. See, first, Adam walked with God. And the sin was they thought they can be ethical, that they could live life without God's instructions.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the snake was telling them, that if you eat from this, you will be like God, being able to decide good and evil. So then they took it upon themselves to try to be like God, and God said, fine, from now on, you will live off the sweat of your brow. In other words, you're going to have to figure everything out on your own. And that's what happens from Genesis chapter 3 to Exodus chapter 20. But then in Genesis chapter 3, it gives the prophecy that the time's going to come when I'm going to equip you to be able to crush the serpent's head. In other words, the serpent was your evil inclination, telling you that you don't need a code to be ethical, that you could do it on your own. And we see this happening in the secular academic world nowadays. You have humanists claiming to be ethical without God. But all they're really doing are standing on the shoulders of giants. In other words, they came from a religious background and they have instilled in them a biblical foundation, whether they acknowledge it or not, because of the religious family they came from.
Mm-hmm.
However, we see with places like the Soviet Union that once they completely toss away God, they just leave a trail of murder and carnage. So Mount Sinai was really prophesied in Genesis chapter 3 that he was going to reestablish that relationship that he initially had with Adam. See, Adam had Torah, but Torah just means instruction. He had instructions directly from the Almighty. No matter how many instructions. From Genesis chapter 3, we see many of the patriarchs acting in an unethical manner, actually doing things even ceremonially against the later Torah that was given, like Joseph not honoring his brother or his parents, Jacob marrying sisters. All these things are prohibited from the Torah. But after Mount Sinai, people didn't have an excuse anymore. People didn't have to figure things out on their own because now that bond was reestablished. The broken bond was remade between God and humanity. What was lost in the Garden of Eden was reestablished on Mount Sinai. If not, one would have to claim that Mount Sinai just came out of nowhere. It doesn't even make sense. If you tie it to Genesis chapter 3, it makes sense that it was prophesied to happen. And everything that we see happening in the book of Genesis and in the early chapters of Exodus are not necessarily things we are to emulate. Yaakov deceived Esav. This is not a good thing. Sarah mistreated Hagar. That's the difference between the Torah and offshoots. Offshoots focus and build their theology off of narrative, while the Torah solidifies ethics based on its instructions. Which is why if someone goes only by the 5 books of Moses alone, they'll never fall into any offshoot or any cult. But all these offshoots and cults are always built on the archaic phrases found in the books of the prophets, not in the Torah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, with that being said, I wouldn't focus so much on what seems to be contradictions in the narrative, because that doesn't really make or break our religion in any way. Even if there wasn't a creation story, even if it started on Mount Sinai, understanding that man ultimately had God and separated himself from God and got reunited on Mount Sinai with God's instructions, understanding that is enough to go forward and flourish with the ethical. That's the basis of our religion. And then everything is built upon that. The oral law is built off of chapter 17 in the book of Deuteronomy that God tells us to listen to the court of elders. It's based in Torah. But outside of that, there's not much in terms of theology that one could really tack onto Torah that's not already endorsed by Torah. You understand?
Mm-hmm. I definitely don't want to go to any offshoot kind of thing, but there are certain things in the narrative that really bother me. So that would be the majority of my questions based on, if you don't mind, because I believe that if you're talking about the Torah, and I understand that that's mainly from, as you said, as it was given from the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. But before that, generally speaking, the 5 books of Moses is also included in the general Torah, isn't it? So we also have the stories. For instance, Abraham was told that he actually kept all the commandments.
What does it say that? It says that he kept my Torot, my instructions.
Mm-hmm.
But there were no all commandments to keep. In other words, nowadays through tradition, we have an idea that there's 613 commandments, but to think that Abraham kept the actual 5 books of Moses or the instructions in the 5 books of Moses before they were even given, it's just not to understand the Hebrew correctly. It just means instructions. Torah means instructions. To say that Abraham kept my instructions, what doesn't mean that he kept my 5 books of Moses.
So are you saying that Abraham wasn't keeping the Torah? He didn't know the Torah?
Abraham did not know what we call the Torah today. Now, the Jews didn't call the Torah the Torah. Nowadays, the Torah encompasses, in many cases, written and even oral law. But in Abraham's time, he kept God's instruction. That's what Torah literally means. So only because he kept my Torah, and some even say, oh, well, that means that not only did he keep the written law, he also kept the oral law before it was even given. That's just silly. The word Torah means instruction. I don't know why anyone would ever make some sort of connection that Abraham actually had the 5 books of Moses before they even occurred as some sort of almanac of things to come. It's kind of nonsensical. And they go even further to say it was given to Adam by an angel. So if you have a problem with little differences in the narrative of the Chumash, I'm surprised that you don't have a problem assuming that Abraham had the 5 books of Moses even before they were actually given.
I didn't take it like that. So what I understood, and this is also from Tovia, if I can speak on his behalf on this, and he said that that actually Abraham knew the instructions. I know that Torah means instructions. Of course, it wasn't given to him in a written form, but he knew them.
Okay.
So
Tovia was wrong. Tovia Singer's wrong on a lot of things. Judaism, as it exists today, is not really monolithic. It's mainly split into 2 groups: mystical rabbis and rational rabbis. So Tovia Singer, I think, sort of goes with the flow, and the vast majority of rabbis who lean towards the mystical believe all the nonsense in Midrashim and that even Adam had 6 laws given to him and 1 law given to Noach. Well, this is what's called Midrash and Agadah. In other words, it's folklore and legend. Now, to say that something's in the Torah when it's not in the Torah goes against 2 direct commands in the Torah. It says, Lo tosef alav velo tegra mimenu. It's the Avirah being a Baal Tosif, of adding to the Torah. You can't add or take away from it. So, if that's what Tovia Singer thinks, then he's wrong. And he's not the only one. Rabbi Mizrahi teaches the same nonsense. But it's kind of hard when you're out there trying to convince people to keep Torah to get them to believe in faith that Abraham had the whole Torah, i.e. all the instructions later given to Israel before Sinai ever happened. It just doesn't make any sense. For sure it's not in the text.
Okay, so do you think it still makes sense to go through some of these contradictions?
Sure, go ahead.
You saying something about it? Okay, so let's see. Here it is, the story of Abraham, and in Genesis 11, it talks about Abraham's family and genealogy. So we learned that Abraham's father is Terah, and Sarah's father is Haran, Abraham's brother, and so Sarah is not the sister of Abraham, if I get that correctly.
Okay.
And then in Genesis 20, 1 to 17, we read about Abraham saying to Abimelech that Sarah is her sister, and that doesn't match the previous one, which is that she's not her sister. Later on, Abraham explains that actually Sarah is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, but still my sister. So Abraham thinks that Sarah is her sister, but according to the genealogy, it's not the sister. So I'm not sure if I'm missing something there.
So there's 2 ways to explain this. One, I think I did the research for this once. But anyways, he says that she is his half-sister or stepsister, actually. Even in the same chapter, I think he goes on to make the statement. He says she is really my sister, I think is in Genesis 20. And then he explains that they have different mothers. Actually, This could be because in biblical Hebrew there's no word for niece or nephew. It's always daughter or sister, even grandfather. It's always father. We see this how he calls Lot his brother when he is technically his nephew. Which, if you think about it, goes against the idea that Abraham would have had the Torah before it was actually given, because the Torah later prohibits these kinds of relations. But really, it's not even an issue, because here we have Abraham lying, or really not clarifying what he meant, because he was trying to save his life, the notion of pekuach nefesh. Now, many rabbis here viewed this as an error in Abraham's part, on how he lost faith in God, and he thought that God was going to abandon him to the Egyptians. Yeah, I mean, I don't think any of this stuff is definitive.
So do you think that the sister is rather like what did you say, that it's not
Right, it was a stepsister. In other
stepsister?
words, the way it's explained is that he's definitely related to her, but he could be lying to Avimelech, and he was lying to him. I mean, these are things that I would have to go into the genealogy to really see, but I don't know if this counts as a contradiction necessarily, because the whole instance was one that he was trying to save his life. He was clearly lying to the king in not stating that she was his wife. Avimelech actually goes up to him and he says, "Why did you lie to me?" Because he got all these boils on his skin for taking Abraham's wife. So I don't know if that's so much of a contradiction.
So, so the next thing is what you actually mentioned about the lying. I'm not really having problem with the lying, although I think it's not great. But that clearly Sarah was Abraham's wife, right?
Yes.
And Abraham is seemingly willingly giving away his own wife, basically agreeing to her adultery.
Correct.
So, I mean, even if he didn't have all the laws written down, I'm sure that this major law, not to commit adultery, I'm sure Abraham knew. So why would he agree willingly to his own wife's adultery? I'm not sure I understand that. If later on he is said that Abraham followed his commandments in Genesis 26:5.
Because it doesn't mean that, like I just explained, it doesn't mean that he kept all of the 613 commandments. All we know between what God told Abraham are a handful of commandments. All the tests that he put him through, including the Akedah in itself was a test. But I think it's almost like a straw man argument. You're saying, well, I was taught that he kept all of God's commandments, and we see him here treating his wife like she's actually his sister. Now, that's probably a question that you should have for Tovia Singer. Like I said, from Genesis chapter 3 to Exodus chapter 20, we're not supposed to emulate what these people did necessarily, because they were trying to figure things out on their own. They didn't have something to go against. Now, I believe that everyone is born with a basic sense of morality. And like Jewish tradition teaches, that the idea is that God offers a Torah to everyone. Now, the way tradition teaches it is that he first offered the Torah to 7 nations. But what that means is that before speaking to Abraham, he spoke to other people. But Abraham was the one who listened and picked up from where he was to where God wanted him to be. So in other words, Abraham definitely had an ethical sense to himself, even though he didn't have these 613 commandments that were later given. But still, with that basic sense of morality, it wasn't enough to really catapult him to idyllic levels of today. In other words, God judged post-Torah humanity differently than pre-Torah humanity, which is why when the Israelites came out of Egypt, we see the Almighty dealing with them very calmly, very softly. However, after he gives them the Torah is when the punishments start to occur, because now they know better. Now they have a system and a standard to aspire to.
Okay.
So, it's done.
So basically, so let's going with that mindset. So then David was living after the Mount Sinai incident, right?
Correct. So
David at one point took someone's wife, Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, And then he killed, actually murdered, um, her husband. Now, this is two sins: murder and adultery, if I'm correct, according to the instructions.
Hmm.
And according to the instructions, a murderer and an adulterer has to die. Instead, what we see that God is sending a prophet, rebuking David for it. David repenting, which is great, but I'm not sure. He still didn't get the final condemnation. I'm not sure if the repentance counts as something against it. Let's say it does. So if you repent, you don't have to get under the condemnation. But then, why is it that for the sin of David, his son had to die? If we read in Deuteronomy that a son shouldn't die for the sin of the father. I don't remember exactly which Deuteronomy.
Sure. I mean, I'm familiar with it.
So I'm not sure how that works.
First of all, we don't derive laws from books outside of the Torah.
Hmm.
In other words, if the Torah lays something down or fails to mention it, it's set in
Hmm.
stone. It's there. It doesn't change. Now, no one praises the act that David did with Uriah. Okay, I mean, everyone viewed that as wrong. Even the prophet Nathan, when he approached David,
Hmm.
it wasn't in a happy manner. So, in the Torah, whenever it speaks about putting someone to death, this is not God doing the killing. This is
Hmm.
the court. This is the elders applying one of the methods of execution to that person.
Hmm.
This does not in any way contradict what happened to King David. The Sanhedrin wasn't adjudicating David, it was God himself. So
Hmm.
God doesn't necessarily have to work within the laws that he proposed on how the court should function. In other words, if that was the case, why do murderers keep on getting away with murder even today? Why doesn't God just strike them dead? It's
Hmm.
because there's a standard for the court to function in, and then there's a way that God chooses to work in. Now, look, we don't know the ways of God, but I don't think it's in any way a contradiction. If God tells us to kill murderers, and then for some reason God knew that David not necessarily directly committed murder, I
Yeah.
mean,
Hmm.
somebody had to be put in the front line.
Hmm.
It was just convenient that in this case it was Uriah, but it could have been
Hmm.
anyone else, and anyone else could have died. That in itself, halachically, could have been a loophole. I'm not arguing for that perspective, but I'm
Hmm.
also not going to state that it's in any way a contradiction of Jewish law.
Hmm.
Also, in terms of the child dying, I also don't think that's a contradiction of Jewish law because the command is given to the court. Everything in Parshat Mishpatim, all these parshiot, when it says Sedek Sedek Tirdov, you should pursue justice, it's speaking to the court. Israelites aren't called to take the law into their own hands and just start killing people because they think they saw you do
Hmm.
something. Everything has to be adjudicated by the court. At that time, the elders, the court of 70 members,
Hmm.
was 71 with Moses. So it's not necessarily a contradiction. And even this in itself is not divinely inspired text. You see, with the books of the writings and even the prophets are there to bring you back to Torah. So if we happen to find something in those books that contradicts the Torah, not that there's anything that contradicts, but if for some reason we may or happen to find something there, it's to be ignored. These books were written and compiled by the men of the Great Assembly.
Hmm.
This is the time of Ezra. They were put into place to bring you back to Torah and to give you a historical account of the life and times of the prophets. That's it. This also doesn't make or break our theology in terms of what happened to King David or if the book of Job is accurate or all this stuff.
Hmm.
There's Torah,
Okay.
and that's all. And then there's Nevi'im and Ketuvim. Now, mind you, Nevi'im and Ketuvim is one book. It's just split up in a bunch of different sections, but it's not Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, how it's taught nowadays. It's like, where they both carry equal weight. No, everything is Torah. Everything is built on Torah, and then Nevi'im and Ketuvim is there to bring you back to Torah. Well, the reason it's one book is because you can't study the prophets without studying the writings, which gives you the historical account of the life and times of those prophets, lest you take the words of the prophets out of context and build a whole new religion off it, which is what Christianity does. So it's not a direct answer to your question, but honestly, like, we don't know exactly what took place there, but I don't think it's a violation of Torah or rabbinic law because the initial commandment was given to the court and not necessarily to say this is how God will always function. As a matter of fact, there's other cases in the historical writings where the Almighty tells Elijah to offer a sacrifice on Mount Carmel, when
Hmm.
that in itself is a violation of Torah law if man would do it, because God said that all the sacrifices have to be done in the temple. And God is here telling him to do this, but the difference is one is given as a command that should be enforced by the court, and the other one is God telling you to do something. Right? It's not
Hmm.
really a contradiction of Jewish law. It's because we're not supposed to build doctrine off of narrative of what the Ketuvim are telling us God is doing.
So basically, there could be the Torah, which is given as a general rule, if I understand correctly, and then God could give specific instructions to specific people, which may not align to that. Is that what you're saying?
Correct, correct. Honestly, we don't have proof that any of this actually happened. Now, I believe it happened, but we have to understand what the men of the Great Assembly were trying to do. They were putting their stamp, their seal, their sign of approval for these books as books that can build up, edify, and strengthen future Israel. But they always made a distinction between it, what they may have compiled or written, and Torah itself, a distinction that is not made today.
Okay.
Here, for example, the average Christian or the average Karaite Jew will quote the book of Kings or the book of Samuel just as reverently as they quote the book of Numbers or the book of Leviticus. Now, there's a
Hmm.
huge disconnect there. One is basically commentary and secondary and there to bring you back to the base, and one is the base. One is the source, and that's what Torah is.
Yeah. Okay. So here is another one then. There's a Ten Commandments, and it says that if someone doesn't follow God, then he will be um, taking that guilt for 3 to 4 generations. Correct? Something like that.
All right.
I'm not. Yeah. And then it.
But that in itself is hyperbolic. It's not necessarily
Okay.
3 to 4 generations. I mean, it says God in some way holds a grudge for so many generations, but he's loving for so many more generations. It's not that someone's going to count. First of all, this is not necessarily part of Torah as something instructional. It's making a statement on how God deals with humanity, but it has nothing to do with anything legal. In other words, it's hyperbolic, it's symbolic. It could say for a very long time. I don't think there's any movement nowadays who walks around saying, okay, well, this is the first generation and you have 2 more generations to go.
Um, yeah. I mean, the point of what I wanted to bring up, it wasn't the number really, but that it seems to be contradicted in Deuteronomy where it says that the son shouldn't take the sin, shouldn't take the guilt for the father. So children shouldn't die for the father. And it seems like that in the Ten Commandments, whether it's um, just an analogy or not, it seems like suggesting otherwise.
Okay.
And also there's for instance like a story. I think it was one of the guys stole a mantle, and then because of that stealing, many people um, started to have some kind of disease or some kind of judgment, and that was because of one man. So I was just asking, how is it that then they are punished for someone else's sin? It seems to me, based on Deuteronomy 24:16, that that shouldn't happen.
In the 10 statements, God is speaking in a relation between God and man, not between man and man. Later on in Deuteronomy, the law is given to be implemented between man and man. In other words, there's a big difference between how God deals with people and how he commands the court to deal with people. The law is that a child should not be put to death for something
Okay. Hmm.
that someone else commits. even the law, an eye for an eye, could never really be practiced in that manner without making Judaism and God seem unethical, right? Because if you kill my son, what does that mean? That I have to kill your son? So what the rabbis have explained it, and even in the text itself, it shows that it's referring to some sort of monetary compensation. So yes, God has different standards for legal injunctions on how he behaves and how he commands the court to behave.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because ultimately the court doesn't always know all the facts, but God does. And the way that portion in the 10 statements is understood, especially by many Christians, they call it something like a generational curse. In other words, there are many times that in reality, God orders the court, but he controls reality. And there's many times in reality that children do suffer for the sins of their parents. We see kids who are born from drug addict mothers. Is that fair? It's not fair to that child, but this is the justice that God himself dispenses from the metaphysical. However, that's different from the instructions that he gave the court in Israel to function within. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
Okay.
I would like to go back to Abraham,
Sure.
if you don't mind. So there's this story with Hagar, and we read in Genesis 16 that Hagar was his wife. Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham as wife, and then we read later that Abraham was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Okay, so and then in Genesis 21:5 we read that Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So that means a difference is 14 years between Isaac and Ishmael. Am I correct so far?
I'll take your word for it. Go ahead.
Okay. So and then we go further, Genesis 21:8. Isaac was weaned. According to my research, that's usually around 2 years. So that makes another 2 years between them. So Isaac is 2 years old and Ishmael is 16 years old at this point. And now we read in 21, 9-10, that Sarah is telling Abraham to cast out the bondwoman, and that the son will not inherit anything. And first of all, who is Sarai to tell Abraham who will inherit what? I thought it was rather the husband who would decide according to the instructions or what God tells him. But that's the smaller problem here. Then later on, we read that Abraham was distressed over the issue. So that shows us that he loved his wife Hagar and his firstborn son Ishmael. Then later on, we go to 21:14, and it says that Abraham placed on Hagar's shoulder bread, skin of water, and the child. Now, at this point, the child is already 16 years old. So how is it that a 16 years old is put on the shoulders of his mother? And then later on, we read further the story, Genesis 21:15. Hagar leaves the child under the bush. Now, how would you leave a 16-year-old under the bush, and why would you need to? A 16-year-old is very well capable of walking and talking, so why would you leave it under the bush? Mm-hmm. And then in Genesis 21:16, Hagar can't watch her 16-year-old child die out of thirst, I guess. Genesis 21:17, God heard the boy's cry. Again, the boy is 16 years old. And then in Genesis 21:18, the angel is telling Hagar to lift up the child and hold in her hand. I'm not sure how do you do that with a 16-year-old. And to top it off all, on 21:19, Hagar gives the 16-year-old child a drink, like Ishmael was totally incapacitated. And if you compare that to the 16 years old, sometimes in Chronicles or Kings we read that they were already kings. So I'm not sure how this is working, or am I miscalculating this whole thing?
I think logically you're miscalculating it, and I'll explain why. You're like,
Okay.
if you have a problem with this, and you don't
Hmm.
have a problem with a few verses before, here people living to
Hmm.
the age of 900, or
Hmm.
Abraham, even in the book of Genesis, were living to the age of 175, then
Hmm.
you haven't realized that they measured time differently, at least in terms of age, than we do now. I mean, just
Hmm.
like nowadays, we age pets differently than we age humans. Now, I
Hmm.
don't have an answer to this, but it makes sense that if just a few verses before you have people were living hundreds and hundreds of years, and even Abraham, like I said, living 175,
Hmm.
that we can apply a lifespan, let's say at the time of King David, who supposedly lived to age 120, and that is really the max,
Hmm.
according to rabbinic literature, that one should live, even to with Tanakh,
Hmm.
then you really shouldn't have a problem with a discrepancy in numbers here. Because, I mean, the discrepancy is all over the place. Why don't you ask me, how
Hmm.
could Adam live 900 years? It doesn't, I don't know. And in Judaism, we don't have a problem saying we don't know. But of course, it's not
Hmm.
enough to say, well, because of this, this invalidates law. I mean, compare this to what appears in the Quran and other books. I mean, the Quran really miscalculates, saying that Mary was in some way the sister of Moses, and
Hmm.
that's a big jump. But if the Torah is as historically accurate as it claims to be, then there has to be some discrepancy between the way we measure a lifespan today and the way they did back then.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned a good point. I do have problem with the verses before as well because as you mentioned, it's also in I guess it's Genesis that a man is given a 120 years max, and yet we see that Noah was living, I don't know, 900 something years, and Shem was living also quite long, 900 something years. And as we know, Abraham lived also quite a long time. So uh, I understand they had a different measure because they lived quite much longer, but I thought that the numbers still should match if it is an inspired book.
That's the
So
thing.
how is it if it is an inspired book by God, and we are not talking about the prophets right now or the writings, then how is it that these years don't match? I mean,
Uh-huh. Because you're ultimately still talking about the writings. Now, this raises really good points that I never really get to share with people. But
mhm,
many rabbis, for example, Rav Sada Gaon, there's a portion specifically in the beginning of Sefer Yoshua that it says that
mhm,
before they enter the land of Israel, they're to write the whole Torah on a few stones in a river. He asks, how can you write the whole Torah on a few stones? I believe it's 12 stones.
uh-huh,
Um, so then he says that whenever it says Torah, it means the instructions within the Torah. In other words, at his time, he understood that people took what's called the five books of Moses today and started calling it Torah. In other words, that this is what was given on Mount Sinai and revealed.
mhm,
And honestly, that's not the case. The Torah is only the instructions within the Torah, and that's what the narrative states. On Mount Sinai, there's no evidence that God gave Moses or the children of Israel the story of Noah or the story of Abraham. All
mhm,
this was passed down only by tradition. What we
mhm,
received from the Almighty, what's divinely inspired, are those instructions that no other civilization at that time could mimic, could duplicate. Now, mind you, there were some ethical laws in the Book of the Dead and the Code of Hammurabi, but
mhm,
as a whole, it didn't compare to the ethical force in which the Torah broke down primitive walls that existed in the world. It civilized humanity. And it's because of the instructions within the Torah, not because of the narrative. And that's why all these offshoots only build on the narrative. They can't improve on perfection. They can't improve on the Torah. So I don't think that a truly educated person should walk around thinking that the Abraham narrative, the Jacob narrative, that every one of those verses came directly from God to man. Now, I know that in the Orthodox world, it's taught almost as a creed, that we believe the whole Torah was, every letter was given by God. That's a statement of faith. Okay? All you really have to believe is, like the narrative states, that it's the commandments that came from God. The Torah, that's what Torah means, commandments. It doesn't mean just a narrative.
So are you saying that within the 5 books of Moses, you would, if you wanted to call it explicitly, that's only the commandments? So basically you are talking about some of the chapters in Exodus where it talks about the instructions, and also some of Leviticus, but whenever it is a narrative, you wouldn't call it per se as inspired or directly coming from God.
I mean, It doesn't make sense. Honestly, anyone who thinks about it, I mean, it wouldn't make sense. Even people in the Talmud itself argue the case of, if Moses wrote every letter as God was dictating it to him, who continued to write it after Moses died? So the argument is that, oh, well, I guess Joshua stepped in and wrote the last few chapters or verses. It seems like there's a dogma they're trying not to depart from. But ultimately, if you try to package this religion and offer it to someone who doesn't have a cultural connection to the people being described there, they're not going to buy it. And mind you, well, honestly, that's not true. I mean, people buy books with larger contradictions, like the Quran or the Book of Mormon, and even the New Testament. For the thinking individual, it's problematic. But if you just go by the narrative alone, dogma aside, orthodoxy aside, it doesn't hurt the narrative at all, because it shows there's really nothing to be learned from Genesis chapter 3 to Exodus chapter 20. And in some cases, the only thing we have to learn from those sections is what not to do. Why? Because they didn't have those instructions. It's those instructions that make that whole sugya, that whole correlation of books exceptional, not the narrative. I mean, I've talked to many people who, after being confronted by an atheist in the street and saying, oh, well, these, a lot of these stories appear in other books, well, they drop religion completely. Why? Because they've based it off the narrative, not the actual life-changing instructions in those books. That's what's divine. That's what can't be duplicated. Anyone could come out with a cooler narrative than just a 6-day creation story. More impressive patriarchs that don't make so many mistakes. And that's really, I think, what argues for its authenticity. You see, modern religions, what they do, they make their biblical heroes, their heroes, seem infallible. They don't make mistakes. They're almost godlike, which, by definition, shows you it's been altered by man, because that's how primitive man thought. But that doesn't please the modern mind. We know that if all this was just made up, the Jews would have made Abraham, Yosef, all these people not make mistakes to be superhuman. But by the simple fact that they relate to the common individual with common day problems, making common day mistakes, shows us that there is some authenticity to this. You know what I mean? I mean, there isn't an agenda. So my answer to this is that sometimes we have to separate dogma from what literally appears in the Torah. And this is a principle in Judaism, that a pasuk doesn't depart from its literal meaning. But then religion steps in, and then you have a whole nation to educate. And it's just easier to, in some way, say everything in there is given on Mount Sinai. Even the story that happened years before Mount Sinai was also given on Mount Sinai. It's silly. It's silly ultimately.
So if let's say Deuteronomy, there's also there's a narrative part to Deuteronomy, but there is also some instructions, right?
Right.
Now, so if we say that, do we say that Deuteronomy, let's say, was written by one person, or was it written by more than one person?
If the text itself says that it's the instructions that came from Hashem, like, why should we assume that the narrative also came from Hashem? It doesn't really make any sense. Of course, you can't say this in a synagogue without being called a heretic. Kind of stupid to teach otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, what I was just trying to get at, if Deuteronomy includes instructions as well, which came from God and that was inspired, and yet, let's say, if you find a contradiction in Deuteronomy that is about the narrative, then you are saying that that is not a problem because that narrative could have been written by someone else, and that wasn't given by God Himself.
Absolutely.
Okay. I see. Okay.
You understand? But we're choosing the wrong things to drop religion over, right? I mean, it's because of man-made creed and dogma. If it doesn't align with actual scrutiny, we drop God and His instructions altogether instead of saying no. Even the text says the instructions came from God, and the narrative is just giving us context. But why does the context also have to come from God? It's not either or here. Read it straight through. I mean, people drop religion for the wrong reasons. And mind you, well, the average person is not going to read straight through and try to theorize all this. Well, they're just going to listen to what their liberal professor tells them in college and throw one or two contradictions and then just basically throw the baby out with the bathwater instead of saying, wait a minute. Even the text says that it's the Torah, it's the instructions that came from God. Right? So I'm going to follow this God because He promises me a long life of blessing if I do so. That's what we count on. I mean, He promises us times of peace, prosperity, right? But it has nothing to do with believing that the Abrahamic narrative and all these things actually happen or hold by every letter and word, which is what you're trying to describe here. Like, this verse isn't aligned with this, and this number doesn't tie into that. And ultimately, you can say this about any offshoot also. Now, a Muslim could be on the other line saying, oh, the same thing about the Quran. The difference with the Quran and the Torah is that the Quran is all narrative and not laws, because all the laws that may appear in the Quran come from the Torah. So you can discredit the Quran, you could discredit with the New Testament, which is also all narrative, but you can't discredit the Torah because the Torah is not narrative. The Torah are the instructions, the practical instructions on how God wants us to behave to ultimately separate us from the animal and to make this world a better place. So that's why the Torah in itself is indestructible, unless you find contradictions in laws.
Yeah, so the question arises in me. I think you have some good points here, which I have to meditate over. But that if I find, let's say, a contradiction in the narrative, so I see that perhaps that wasn't inspired by God. It includes some errors of man. Okay. Now,
you have that? Wait. So why do you use that word "inspired by God"? Because that's the word that the rabbis and the theologians use. Remind you, the rabbis never even use the word divinely inspired or inspired by God. That's something developed by Christians. In the Talmud, it's called books that are mitamei yadayim, like books that would impurify your hands, or books that were set apart for study. Okay, now the Torah is the Torah. I'm sure that if you read the 5 books of Moses straight through, this notion of divinely inspired would not even cross your mind. Well, you would have laws that came straight from God, and then a platform to display those laws, and that platform is the narrative, right? But I'm pretty sure if you read the Torah straight through, you'd never come to the conclusion that even the narrative was given by God. Religion taught you that.
I'm not saying. I think it totally makes sense that it wasn't. God didn't give the narrative. God didn't say, to Moses, write down the narrative. It was apparently Moshe or Joshua or whoever it was. But all I'm saying is that if he was a man of God, then he could make it. He could pay attention and not to make mistakes in the narrative, for instance.
I never said that
he,
God in some way told Moses the narrative. I'm pretty sure because they were a tribe, they were a people, they had their own tradition of who their ancestors were and what took place before. And every civilization at that time had some understanding of how their tribe viewed creation. And mind you, they all believed in creation. Like whether the earth was sitting on the back of a turtle. That narrative didn't necessarily have to be given by God for the Torah to be true and something for us to emulate. But try explaining that to the average Jew nowadays.
So I think I have one more question, and I think that would be the end of my questionnaire here. Is that how do we know that instructions, the Torah, is correct or that it is inspired by God? How do we know? How do we validate? Okay. Is it by experience that we see that if we apply it to our life, then it is effective? Or do we validate it by God talking to us? Or how do we know that those parts, at least, that is written, Hashem said so and so and so, where it is quotation marks, right? That those things that are true and valid. How do we know?
Because they work. The Judeo-Christian ideal even, or Judeo-Islamic ideal, is ultimately what has civilized this world. And the reason I include Christianity and Islam is because even like the Rambam taught, that Muhammad and Jesus did more for spreading biblical ethics and values more than any other movement, even Judaism, ever did. But it's because it works. Every society that has adopted some sort of biblical standards of morality have progressed in an ethical manner. And countries that haven't have remained primitive or have ultimately destroyed themselves. Like the example I given with communism. More people have died over communism than over any other single religious belief. Over 180 million since the founding of communism, which basically threw the Bible in the trash. When they say that the Bible is the greatest book ever sold and this and that, of course, when a Christian is telling you that, I mean, he's showing you a Christian Bible. But what they fail to acknowledge that the only ethical portions of the Bible are the 5 books of Moses. And it's those 5 books that have civilized this world, not the offshoot. Forget about the narrative, right? People aren't choosing not to do evil because a story about King David or a story in the prophets. It's because God is telling you, do this and do that and I will bless you. He's the one telling you that murder is wrong, not because you feel or think it's wrong, but because I say it's wrong. You understand? It's those 5 books that's the basis of everything, and people have lost complete sight of that. As a matter of fact, this whole notion of a Tanakh is actually a Catholic invention. Jews have never combined the Torah with any other book. Why? Because the rabbis were scared that people would walk around thinking that something that appears in the books of the prophets is in some way on the level to something that appears in the Torah. There's always a distinction between the Torah and the writings of the prophets. But nowadays, whether you have it all in one book, you start to believe that it carries equal weight. And the average Christian walks around quoting the book of Mark just as reverently as he quotes the book of Deuteronomy. For him, it's all divinely inspired because they're thinking within dogma. And they have completely lost sight of how we distinguish God's instructions from everything else. I mean, sometimes religion is the enemy, but religion is good in many cases because it helps us to progress in a uniform manner. But if you check your brains at the door, you lose for those who are more academically inclined that things actually have to make sense to them. So they'll just drop the whole religion because they're like, oh, well, there's a contradiction here in the narrative, right? So, but like I said, most people don't care about contradictions. If it's like that, then everyone would be Jewish, which in my opinion is probably the monotheistic religion with the least contradictions.
So you mentioned that how we know that the instructions are correct is because it works. Now, isn't it a little bit relative what works? Because when I was a Christian, I thought that worked, and I realized that is actually totally against the Torah, what is written there. And also at the same time, maybe some Hinduist or Buddhist would say that, yeah, they are following whatever chakra they want, and it works. So how do we define that it what is what works and what doesn't?
I don't think the New Testament contradicts the Torah in any ethical manner. It contradicts it in theology, in the ceremonial, in the religious, but not in the ethical. In other words, Christian societies, and I would consider the United States and ultimately Western Europe, are based off of the ethics in the Torah. And, for example, Hindu societies, where you have concepts like reincarnation, all these things hinder progress in a society because people feel like, oh, well, I don't have to improve my generation or my family in this life because I always have this other life to complete my tasks in. So it typically gets you not to progress, not to live, in reality. Now, mind you, I mean, Kabbalah nowadays has adopted this notion, this idiotic notion of reincarnation in Judaism. Now, God knows I wish reincarnation is true. I mean, I want to keep on coming back as much as I can, right? But I'm not going to say the Torah teaches it. Why? The Jewish people have always been very earthly minded, and that's what gets us to progress. But the job is to perfect this life, this world. And that's what the Torah does. It grounds you to the place that you live in. Every command in the Torah that promises you some sort of reward, or how Christians misinterpret to be salvation, is talking about earthly salvation, earthly reward, peace with the ultimate goal. This is what the Torah promises, not heaven. Mind you, I believe in a heaven and a hell, but I think that the notion of an afterlife in Judaism or in the ethical monotheistic religions has been almost like a virus, which is why we see groups like ISIS today blowing themselves up because they become too heavenly good that they're no earthly good. In other words, if the afterlife was so important, but the Torah would have mentioned something about it, but it's completely silent. Tanakh is completely silent on the afterlife. Why? Because it wants you to be earthly minded. It wants you to take these instructions and make the world better. But, right, and when they inserted a notion of eternal reward, perpetual kingdom in the heavens, and eternal punishment, everyone from the time that they wake up to the time that they go to sleep is just focused on trying to secure themselves a place in this celestial kingdom.
So do you think there will be a final judgment on mankind?
Well, the Torah says in Parshat Nitzavim that there's going to be a judgment, but that could be every time somebody dies. Now, Jewish theology later on, specifically more in the books of the prophets, but mainly in rabbinical writings, created the notion of a resurrection of the dead, a perpetual age of peace in the Messianic reign. All these things don't appear in the Torah. As a matter of fact, the notion of the Messiah doesn't appear in the Torah. All it lays down is a formula for exile and redemption, and it lays it down in a circular manner. In other words, it's going to happen over and over again, and this is what we see has happened in Jewish history. I mean, this isn't our first exile. This is our third exile. The first was the Assyrian exile with the 10 northern tribes. The second was the Babylonian exile, and now we're in the Roman exile. In other words, in the Babylonian exile, we repented, God brought us back, i.e., He redeemed us. I mean, nowadays, redemption is in some way viewed as someone getting you out of hell and getting you into heaven. But redemption in the Torah means that He just brought you back to the land, gave you an opportunity to succeed or to fail again. And in the case of the 10 northern tribes, with the exile to Assyria, they didn't repent and thus were not redeemed and are not with us anymore. Right? It's all about this planet and making this world a better place. However, if Judaism or whatever religion you're in doesn't make you a better person and doesn't make your society better, then it's a false religion and you should choose a different religion. But being that every ethical monotheistic religion is built off of the 5 books of Moses and the instructions contained within them, tells me that it's still a solid, firm ground for us to stand on.
Okay. I think that was it. There are some food for thought. So thank you very much for the call. I guess that was it for me.
No problem. Take it easy.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay,
bye. Bye.